Welcome back to Kris versus Everybody. This is the show that I talk about anything and everything unedited, uncensored. Follow me on Spotify and Apple Podcast and YouTube by clicking the subscribe or the follow button to never miss a new episode. Today I'm going to talk about somebody that I didn't even know who the fuck they were until I saw them on TikTok. Larry Elder. And I'm going to respond to a claim that he says that systemic racism doesn't exist. Now, before we get into what he said, Larry Elder is a conservative talk host, author, and political figure in the US. His ideology, strongly conservative, libertarian leaning, focuses on personal responsibility, limited government, and free market ideas. His politics, he ran for the 2021 California recall election, trying to replace Gavin Newsom as governor, which he lost. He's an author. He written books criticizing what he sees as government overreach, and cultural issues in America. His controversial takes, he's known for making statements claiming systemic racism isn't a major issue in America, which is why his name comes up for today's episode. Now, Larry Elder says there's no such thing as systemic racism in America. None. Zero. And listen, this isn't new. This is a long-standing argument from certain political perspectives. But just because something is said confidently doesn't mean it's correct. And just because something isn't experienced personally doesn't mean it doesn't exist structurally. It sounds like if racism isn't obvious, then it must be gone. But reality is rarely that simple. First, what do we mean by systemic racism? We're not talking about someone calling you a racial slur. We're not talking about one bad cop, one bad teacher, or one bad boss. We're talking about patterns, systems, outcomes that repeat over and over and over and over and over again, no matter who's in charge. Systemic racism is when the rules, policies, and practices intentionally or not produce unequal results for different racial groups. Now, let's talk about housing. Let's talk about housing. That's my first bullet point. I have three. Here are three things. My pastor Stacy always used to say this. Here are three things to prove that this exists, to prove that systemic racism exists in America. Let's talk about housing. You can't discuss systemic racism without mentioning redlining. For decades, Black families, I'm specifically talking about Black families because I am a Black man. I can't talk for other people. I can only talk about me and my people. For decades, Black people, Black families were legally blocked. This was a law in America. Black families were legally blocked from buying homes in certain neighborhoods. Banks would not lend to Black families. At the time, Black men. Neighborhoods were marked as hazardous simply because Black people lived there. And when you're marked as a hazardous neighborhood, people don't want to invest in that neighborhood. The neighborhood deteriorates, and then boom, you have a ghetto. Now, someone might say, well, that's just the past. Well, okay, but wealth is built over time. Homes, even though it was back in the early 1900s, homes are the number one way families built generational wealth in America. So if you take away Black families' number one way to build generational wealth, if one group is locked out for decades, what do you think that does to wealth gaps today? That's not opinion. That's cause and effect. Now, this is not an excuse. This is just an explanation of why you see things in America today. Now, let's talk about education. Schools are funded largely by property taxes. Going back to the homes conversation, people were blocked from buying homes. So where did these Black people live? Well, the ones who could afford it could go to places with homes. But majority of the people of color did not live in homes. They either rented, either rented a home, okay, a double, or they lived in apartments. Schools are funded largely by property taxes. So if you live in a wealthy neighborhood with homes, people paying property taxes, your school will get more funding. In theory, that's just the theory of how this works in America. If you live in an under-resourced area, your school gets less. Now go back to the housing discrimination and tell me those things are not interconnected, because what systemic means, it's not just one decision. It's how multiple systems stack on top of each other. If you keep Black people from getting homes, they can't put property taxes into their own neighborhood, which means their school is going to be worse, which means they're not going to be learning as much as the wealthier people, in theory. Now let's talk about criminal justice. My final point. Black Americans make up about 13%. Let's just give it a round number. 13, let's just do 15%. Black Americans make up 15% of the United States population. But a much larger percentage of the prison population. Now, again, the argument would be, well, that's about crime, not race. But when you dig deeper into sentencing, policy patterns, and prosecutorial discretion, you start seeing disparities that don't fully line up with behavior alone. That's not accidental. That's intentional. That's policy that is intentional to keep certain people, quote unquote, in line or out of or away from success. Now, to be fair, people like Larry Elder will point to success stories, and those stories do matter. There are Black millionaires. There's a lot of Black families that are doing well for themselves, including me. Black business owners, Black leaders, even a Black president in Barack Obama. But here's the mistake. Individual success, Larry Elder, does not erase systemic patterns. He likes to bring up Barack Obama as the first Black president. Yeah, he's the first Black president, number 44. He's 1 out of 44. 1 out of 44 presidents at the time. So please, stop it, Larry. You can have exceptions and still have a system. Let me put it in simpler terms for you, Larry Elder. If one person makes it out of a broken system, that tells you something about that person. If millions of people struggle in the same ways across generations, that tells you something about the system. Now, here's where the conversation gets really uncomfortable. Because I like to make people uncomfortable, because if you stay comfortable, you'll never change. You'll never think about things a different way. Because some people hear systemic racism and think it means, you're calling me a racist. Don't call me a racist. I never said something like that. You know what I mean. Don't do that to me. I didn't say something racist. You're just saying that. That's not what it means. You can benefit from a system without creating it. You can participate in a system without even realizing it. And you can acknowledge a system without blaming individuals. Because if you deny the system exists, then you don't have to fix anything. If you don't have to ask the hard questions, you don't have to change policies. Everything becomes about personal responsibility and only personal responsibility. Now, don't get me wrong, personal responsibility matters. It matters a lot in the United States. But we are focusing on the collective, the bigger picture, the systemic problems in America. We've already acknowledged systemic issues before in this country. We talk about systemic poverty. We talk about systemic inequality. We even talk about systemic failures in government. So why is it so hard for some people to accept that race can be part of a system too? 19th century America, they should have a class that you must pass with an A+ to ensure that we do not repeat what we did in this country to certain people. When someone says systemic racism doesn't exist, what they're really saying is, I don't see it, because not seeing something doesn't mean it isn't there. And that's the conversation. It's not about guilt. It's not about blame. It's about reality. Because if we're serious about moving forward, Larry, if we're serious about building a better country, then we got to be willing to look at the full picture, not just the parts that make us feel comfortable and help us sell books. And that is another episode of Kris versus Everybody. See y'all next time.